Today I want to take a look at the Export-CLI XML commandlet, and this is one that we use to create an XML representation of objects and store into a file. So similar to Export CSV or some of our other flat file snapshots, but this one is an XML format. Where would that be useful? Well, two big scenarios. If the downstream import requires XML, you're taking some data out of PowerShell to prepare it for a downstream system that requires XML. The other might be nesting and hierarchy, parent, child, grandchild, where the data has layers to it. And that's where we end up with parameters like depth for int32. So it's actually very useful if you have a nested hierarchy of data, and we'll take a look at that as we walk through some of the examples. So there are just, I believe, 4 examples on Export XML, and we'll take a look at each. The very first is saving a text file down to sample.xml, or a text string, and this text string is very simple. We'll go ahead and take that and do sample XML. There we go. Right. So here we have, this is a test, and that's a very easy example that kind of shows us the data. And it came through as a simple string, so we get some auto formatting. And we do have a header, version 1.1, PowerShell, schema, just so that it's proper XML formatting. Okay, well that's taking a flat string. We can do this with other data, so we might want to take a file and get the ACL, the permissions for it. And for that, I'm going to change to a real file name that's on the system and go ahead and execute the get ACL by itself. Comes back with a little bit of detail. Now, what's interesting about this, and the reason we're using this as an example, is we have 3 properties on the default command, but you can see that there's something else going on. Access has this sort of expanded multi-value cell. So there's another layer here. There's another level of data. And interestingly enough, if we took that command and we manually execute the get ACL portion, but we were to maybe take it and add dot access on the ending, we'll actually see that we have multiple entries. Access.count has 4. So we have 3 primary attributes, but then access itself has 4 underneath. And this is the layering that works very well for an example with the XML format. So now we can go ahead and bring this over to File ACL, open up our schema and take a look. And what we have is a couple of properties at the root level. There we are. And then we have more properties underneath. So we do have the file system rights, file system audit rule, MS props. We'll go and expand this one. PS drive info C, props. And you can see all of the different nesting of the various properties underneath. Group, owner, what the access rights are. We have SID numbers, allow, read, execute, modify, but the data is layered in, parent, child, grandchild. We have several levels to it. And looking at this in either Notepad++ or VS Code is going to be a really good way to get the expand collapse experience where you can kind of walk the tree and see the different types of data being represented. So we do have a lot of entries here, and it's kind of interesting just to check out how all that data is structured. But this is more rich than a flat CSV. It has more depth to it. It has more layers. And so NTFS permissions, get file ACL, really good example for that. Now, if we wanted to turn things around and run file ACL as import CSV, so we're reading a snapshot, and then we can highlight just the variable name to press F8, we're able to come back and get the data in the same format that we began with. So it works in both directions. I mean, today's focus is on the export command, but you can also import and bring the data backwards to hydrate a variable in memory from a flat XML file. The next one we'll take a look at for example 3 is joining a profile, credential, and then doing an export and import. So we'll come over to the documentation. And this was exporting an object to look at the file ACLs that we just did. And now we're going to export an encrypted And now we're going to encrypt an exported credential object. So this is kind of interesting. Only exports credentials on Windows, Mac, and Linux don't support that. Okay, yes, yes. Now, looking at example 3, the one thing that I would do differently with this is some way to receive the credential. Because if you run the example code as is from the documentation, it's actually not going to show much that's that interesting. You're going to create an XML path. Okay, where do we want to save it? And then you're going to take an object and write it to that path. And if we go use Notepad to inspect the file created, what we're going to find out is that we have an empty file, nil. There's nothing there. So the one thing I would do different on this example is a get credential command so that we receive some sort of data that we can actually work with. So I'm going to add a line to this example. And here we can just do sort of a test credential. And now same thing will follow. What's the path for where we're going to save? Okay, that's a file path. We're going to export the file down. Okay. And then in the reverse, creating the path, take a look at it and do an import to bring it back, and then echo the credential object. And that is the same thing that I input, the test username. That's what I input with get credential. So this allows us to save an encrypted credential into a XML, like a configuration file that's holding a system account, username, password, or maybe a client secret. You want to save something to a configuration file encrypted. But I do think it needs that one extra step to prompt where we're going to have the input for what credential are we working with. So we're going to take a look at the file created. And here you can see the encrypted password, and there's the username that we did. And this is a PS credential object. So the cool thing about the XML data type is that it is fully aware of data types. This can be hydrated into PowerShell and preserve that it's a PS credential object, not just some generic XML of whatever system, but that it is very specifically a PS credential object. And one thing to take a look at that would be the get type method so that we know it's not coming back as just some generic hash table, right? We don't have a hash table property coming in here. It's not a generic string. It is a very specific PS credential. And that's cool because that gives us a lot to work with. And we'll come down and take a look at the final example, which does have the get credential prompt, example 4. Which we've already executed. Then we can export that to cred2. All right, that's fine. Get the content of cred2. That shows us the encryption, password format, hex, Unicode. Yeah, so this kind of gives you an idea of how the formatting works with the example 3 and 4 together. Exporting credential object on Linux or Mac OS. So example 4, kind of built for the PowerShell.NET Core running on non-Windows systems. So if you were to run this on Linux or Macs, it's going to work a little bit differently. And it does not provide encryption, but it's more of obfuscation. So it's more of a different formatting, so it's not plain text to read, but it isn't as secure as encryption, which example 3 provided. So those are examples on how to use Export-Clixml. This also has some use cases with JSON arrays where you have nesting in JSON, that there's a parent, child, grandchild hierarchy. You want to preserve all of that. It may be useful with other types of rich objects where you want to preserve the data type of that rich object, not exporting it as generic text, but really preserving the data type that PowerShell provides, like we saw when we had our credential object and we did get type method, and we see that when it was hydrated from the import statement, it actually preserved the PS credential. So that's a good introduction on Export CLI XML. Thanks for watching.